Something happened at a dinner with my husband's friends that I still can't stop thinking about. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, no confrontation, nothing you could point to and say, there, that was the moment. And that is exactly why it stayed with me. Because the truth about how a man really sees you rarely arrives with an announcement. It arrives quietly, in a room full of people who aren't thinking about you at all, which is precisely why it is so easy to miss. You have probably had a version of this moment yourself. A gathering, a dinner, a weekend with people who know him better than you sometimes feel you do. You walked away from it without realizing what had actually just happened in front of you. That is not a failure on your part. Most women are trained to watch the relationship directly, not the space around it. And that is exactly why the clearest signal of all is the one almost nobody is taught to look for. There's a question I want you to hold for the entire length of this video. What do his friends actually reveal about him that he never says out loud? Because by the end of what I am about to share with you, you will understand how to read that answer, and you will never sit through a dinner like that the same way again. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you'd forget by dessert, except I didn't. We were seated around a long table at one of his oldest friends' houses, the kind of dinner that happens 3 or 4 times a year. Comfortable, familiar, nothing to prepare for. Everyone was talking over each other the way people do when they've known each other for 20 years. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, one of the wives leaned toward me and asked a question that had nothing to do with the conversation at the table. She asked how I was really doing. Not how the trip was, not how work was going, how I was really doing. It was such a specific, quiet question that it barely registered as unusual in the moment. I answered, we moved on. The night continued the way you'd expect a dinner like that to continue. But later, in the car, I found myself replaying it because that question hadn't come from nowhere. Someone doesn't ask you how you're really doing unless they already have a reason to wonder. And I realized I had no idea where that reason had come from or what conversation somewhere else had planted it. That is the moment most women drive home from without realizing what it means. You have probably sat through a version of this exact scene. A friend's wife, a colleague, someone in your shared circle who says something slightly too specific, slightly too informed, and you brush past it because the night is moving fast and there is wine and noise and a dozen conversations happening at once. It feels like nothing. It rarely is nothing. What these small, precise moments are actually doing is giving you an unedited look at a conversation your partner has been having about you. One that happened somewhere you weren't present, in a room you never entered. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't this just be coincidence? Couldn't one well-placed question just be that person being kind? Yes, sometimes it is exactly that. But what separates a warm question from an informed one is specificity. And specificity always has a source. That night, I didn't know the source yet, but I knew I had just glimpsed the first thread in something much larger. That small thing turned out to be the first thread in a pattern she hadn't noticed until that night. Psychologists call it a proximity blind spot. The unconscious tendency to focus our attention on the relationship we are inside of while filtering out the information being reflected back to us from the relationships around it. And almost every woman has one. It isn't a character flaw. It is the natural result of how we are wired to invest in romantic attachment. When you are emotionally close to someone, your brain dedicates most of its relational bandwidth to monitoring that central connection, reading his moods, tracking shifts in his behavior, interpreting the space between the two of you. The peripheral signals, the ones coming from his friends, his colleagues, the people he spoke to before he came home to you, tend to drop out of conscious awareness entirely. This is why women can spend years inside a relationship without ever reading what that relationship looks like from the outside. And here is the part that most explanations skip over entirely. The people around your partner are not neutral. They are not blank observers who have formed no opinion and received no information. They are the people he talks to when you are not in the room. They are the audience for the version of you that he presents when you have no say in how that presentation is made. What they think of you, how they treat you, how much space they give you in a conversation, none of that is random. It is the direct product of how he has spoken about you when you couldn't hear him. Most women spend years focusing on the relationship itself and almost no time reading the room around it. You might be wondering whether this means you need to start auditing every social interaction for hidden meaning. No, that is not what I'm suggesting, and it is not how this works. Context always matters, and a single warm question or a single cold shoulder tells you very little on its own. What tells you something is a pattern. And to see the pattern, you first have to understand what you're actually looking at, which most women don't because nobody ever explained it to them. Once she knew what to look for, she couldn't stop seeing it, starting with something one friend said in the kitchen. He didn't mean for me to hear it. That's exactly why it mattered. It was maybe 40 minutes into the evening, the kind of moment when the formal part of the dinner is over and people start to spread out across the house. I was in the kitchen, just rinsing a glass, not really part of any conversation, and two of his friends were talking near the back door. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard my name. What followed was not dramatic. That is the part I want you to stay with, because I think this is where most women get misled. They wait for something large and obvious, a comment that crosses a line clearly enough to act on. What I heard was small. One friend said to the other, in a tone that was easy and unguarded, that I had been handling a lot lately, and that he thought my husband was lucky to have someone that steady. That was it. An ordinary sentence. The kind of thing you could pass 100 times without stopping. But I stopped. Because I hadn't told either of those men anything about what I was handling. My husband had. Not in a way that was inappropriate or oversharing, but in the way that people talk when they trust each other, when they process their lives out loud with the people they're close to. He had told them something true about me, something that was actually happening, something that required him to pay attention to it, and then to carry it into a conversation with someone else. What that friend said in the kitchen was not really about me. It was about what my husband had noticed and then thought worth mentioning. Now, you might hear this and think, that is a nice thing, but it is also private. And yes, you are right to notice that tension. The question of what a partner shares about you is a complicated one, and it depends enormously on what he is sharing and why. A man who talks about your vulnerabilities with friends in a way that reduces you, that is one thing. A man who references what you are carrying because it has entered his mind enough to come out in conversation, that is something else entirely. What that friend revealed was that my husband had been paying attention, quietly, in the way that people do when they actually care. The comment raised a bigger question. Was this one friend, or was this how they all saw her? One comment is a moment. 3 comments are a pattern. And once I started watching for the pattern, it became very difficult not to see it everywhere across that evening. There is something behavioral researchers have observed about social groups that most of us never consciously apply to our own lives. The way a group treats a member of its innermost circle is rarely an independent judgment. It is a reflection of a norm, an unspoken standard that someone in a position of authority within the group has quietly established. In a close male friendship group, that person is usually the man whose partner you are. He is the one who, over years of conversation, has built the frame through which everyone else in that group first learned to see you. And they follow it, most of the time, without even knowing they're following it. The group shows you what he has built for you inside his world, even when he is not in the room. What does this actually look like? It looks like one of his friends making sure you are part of the conversation when the group starts to drift into territory you could reasonably be excluded from. It looks like someone asking your opinion on something, genuinely waiting for the answer, not just being polite. It looks like eye contact held a beat longer than social obligation requires, or a joke made at his expense rather than yours when the room is finding its footing. It looks like the absence of a particular kind of dismissal, the subtle, barely visible way that a group will redirect around a person they have quietly decided doesn't belong at the center of things. And it looks, sometimes, like a question asked at the right moment in the right tone. Of course, no group is perfectly consistent, and not every social dynamic reflects the relationship at its center. His friends might simply be kind people who treat everyone this way, and that is worth accounting for. But when you watch across an entire evening, not one interaction, but the cumulative texture of how they orient toward you, the pattern becomes much harder to dismiss. It is the difference between one warm handshake and an entire room that makes space for you without being asked. That realization pointed towards something bigger, something her husband had built without her ever knowing it existed. Remember what I told you at the start? That there was something most women not only miss, but couldn't have named? Something that was already happening around them without any announcement. We are at that part now. And I want you to slow down here with me, because this is the piece that changes how you understand everything that came before it. There is a kind of respect a man gives you that you are never supposed to see. That night, I saw it. It is not the respect that shows up in the things he says to your face, though that matters too. It is the respect that shows up in the things he says about you when you are not there, in the stories he chooses to tell, in the way he frames your struggles, in whether he presents you as someone to be understood or someone to be managed. Most women spend entire relationships never knowing which version of themselves is being spoken about in rooms they don't enter. And that invisibility is not neutral. It shapes everything. It shapes how his friends treat you when he steps out of the room. It shapes whether they ask how you're really doing or whether they simply don't think to ask at all. What his friends reveal is not really about them. It is about what he has quietly built for you in the world he carries outside of your relationship. Now, I want to be honest with you because this works in both directions. A man who speaks about his partner in ways that diminish her, that create the impression that she is difficult or unreasonable, or someone to be tolerated, will create a room that subtly reflects that impression back to her. You may have experienced this without ever having the language for it. The group that is technically polite but never fully warm. The conversations that pause slightly when you walk in. The sense that there is a social temperature in the room that you didn't cause but also can't quite reach. That temperature was set before you arrived. This is the signal most women feel without understanding where it comes from. And the other version of this is equally real and equally powerful and far more rare than it should be. A man who has spoken about you with genuine warmth, who has shared your resilience, your humor, your depth, in the unguarded way people do when they actually admire someone, creates a room that receives you differently. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but in the way that a conversation opens up when you speak, or in the specific quality of being heard rather than simply tolerated. It is a warmth that feels slightly too familiar for how little time you have actually spent with these people. And that gap is the tell. The gap between how well they know you and how warmly they treat you is the exact size of what he has said about you in your absence. That night, sitting back down at the table after the kitchen, I understood that for the first time. And I understood something else, which was that I had been lucky, not by accident, but by the specific, quiet choices of a man who had decided, long before that dinner, that the version of me he carried into his friendships was one worth protecting. So what do you do with this now? Because this is not a framework for suspicion. It is a framework for clarity. And the distinction matters enormously. Of course, not every group is close, and not every silence means something. But there is one pattern that rarely lies. Watch the quality of inclusion. Not whether his friends are polite to you. Politeness is almost always present regardless. But whether they include you in a way that feels specific to you or generic to anyone who might be sitting in your chair. Generic inclusion looks like courtesy. Specific inclusion looks like someone referencing something you said last time, or asking a follow-up to a conversation you thought had been forgotten, or finding you after dinner to finish a thought that got interrupted at the table. Specific inclusion means he has spoken about you often enough that who you are has become something they actually know. And there is an inverse worth noting, gently. If you find yourself in rooms that feel technically fine, but quietly distant, where no one is unkind, but the warmth never quite reaches you, try not to interpret that as a reflection of how likable you are. It may have very little to do with you. It may be a reflection of how you have been spoken about or not spoken about in spaces you were never invited into. You cannot control what he says about you when you are not present, but you can learn to read what those rooms are telling you. And once you can do that, you have access to one of the most honest pieces of information available inside any relationship. Not what he says to you, but how the world he has built receives you. Pay attention to the room. It has been talking this whole time. The difference between a room that receives you and one that merely tolerates you, that distinction is worth understanding deeply. What this all comes back to is something quieter and more fundamental than any single signal. The people closest to a man do not form their impressions of his partner independently. They form them in conversation with him over time, across 100 ordinary moments when he chose what to say and what to leave out. That is not a small thing. It is one of the truest measures of how someone holds you, not in the moments when you are watching, but in the accumulated weight of how they carry you when you are gone. Once you understand that, you stop watching the relationship only from the inside. You start reading the room. And that is not an anxious thing. That is not a surveillance project. It is simply a new layer of awareness, the kind that comes from understanding how social dynamics actually work, rather than hoping that warmth will find you on its own. You now have something you didn't have at the start of this video. You have a way of seeing something that was always there. Have you ever noticed how your partner's friends treat you when he is not watching? Tell me what you noticed. I read every comment on this channel, and I want to hear what came up for you when you thought about it. If these kinds of insights are useful to you, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel is built around the same principle, helping you see what is actually happening in the relationships around you, not just what is being said out loud. There is more of this to come, and I think you will find it worth staying for. In the next video, I will show you the one moment at any gathering that reveals whether his friends see you as an equal or an outsider.